What size screen will the Switch Successor have? Will Nintendo stick with OLED or return to LCD? And will there be a single screen, or is double screen gaming back in contention? It's an area with a lot of rumours and a lot of passionate views, so let's try to cut through and forecast what we think the likelihoods really are concerning the Switch 2's screen. And I will start by addressing the fact that this channel primarily is about research and forecasting probabilities based on general principle. I tread very carefully when it comes to technical details, which are not my forte to the same degree as other aspects, and also while I try to keep abreast of the Nintendo news scene, I don't obsessively track down every single rumour. Rumours being rumours, they often end up wrong as right and can skew the discussion, especially when the rumours sound too good to be true or simply make for good copy. Therefore, while there are probably lots and lots of rumours that have circulated about what screen size and screen specifications Nintendo could be utilising for their new machine, I'm going to start instead from basic principles. First of all, it's going to be tricky for Nintendo to sell a system that is significantly smaller in terms of screen size than the Nintendo Switch. The OLED was a deluxe model and so could be a little larger, but the original Switch's 6.2-inch screen feels to me like a lower tramline of possibility. Any smaller and the console ceases to feel like a chunky hybrid system and starts to feel like Nintendo are truly going back to their handheld roots. The smaller the screen size, the less space the console has to incorporate new tech, and while chips are ever smaller, that's still a big hit when you consider that the new standard of bezel-free technology means that a 6.2-inch screen would be in a significantly smaller chassis than the original Switch. Perhaps signalling a move to pin down the handheld market wouldn't be such a bad thing, as the Switch has increasingly become a handheld device for many people, but Nintendo's early research suggested that handheld and docked play was about even, and early on they promoted the Switch as a home console just as much as a handheld. And if they want to compete in the third-party space, I think Nintendo will want to lead with their console as a living room offering once again. The PlayStation and Xbox consoles are in the middle and perhaps even entering the second half of their lifespan, so the time is right for Nintendo to emerge as a disruptive competitor with tech, yes, less powerful, but more modern and able to more nimbly take advantage of AI and other tools that have emerged since the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X came to market. I would put as a 10% chance that the new Switch will have a smaller than 6.2-inch screen. Basically, the original Switch screen size is the bare minimum, although if they do go smaller, it will be for a particular reason, which I will address towards the end of the video. But let's look to the size of the Switch OLED. There is certainly a chance that they decide the Switch OLED is their optimum form size. The screen could probably extend marginally into the corners, but not by a huge degree. There is a chance that by keeping the overall footprint, they can keep the option to use Joy-Con and possibly even old docks, but ultimately, I don't know why it would be in Nintendo's interest to do this. They want to sell you new equipment, and a new console would come with a new dock anyway. Plus, if rumours are true that the dock contains cooling, then it definitely won't be compatible with the previous Switch docks. There's no intrinsic reason to keep the form factor of the Switch, and if anything, a slight differentiation in size will be one factor that identifies it in the marketplace. So how much bigger could the new Switch get? 8 inches still has to be in the ballpark for a new system. However, the Japanese tend to like smaller form factors, so I feel that 8 inches or above falls into the 10% chance category. So we're looking most likely at something with a screen size between 6.2 and 7.9 to 8 inches. The Switch had the advantage that they could keep the same form factor but reduce the bezel to increase the screen size. And I remember for years before the OLED model was announced, the screen size of any revision was pretty much a dead certainty because the bezel size basically served as a big red flag of Nintendo's intentions. But it would now be downright weird to launch a system with a bezel, given how the trend in tech is so much against them, and this means that Nintendo has fewer options for a revision if they require the form factor of the device to remain the same. For example, if they have clip-on Joy-Con again, which would necessitate the base unit being the same size. This is one factor I would suggest that makes built-in controllers more likely than having Joy-Con again. Also, with Joy-Con potentially able to clip in and new Joy-Con likely to be sold as extra devices, there's still the capacity to sell extra Joy-Con, even if the new system is an integral all-in-one device. They might even prove a little bit more resilient than the Switch Joy-Con have been. My OLED model Joy-Con lasts a little better, but the up arrow on the left Joy-Con has now given up the ghost. So if they're not bound by a size, that means they can decrease the bezel, and if they don't need to keep a consistent form factor across the generation, they're bound chiefly by the size of the tech they want to put inside. After all, any form factor of screen between 6.2 and 8 inches would be pretty comfortable, but the key determinant of the Switch Successor's power is going to be what's inside. However, even the tiniest fraction of an inch on the outside is going to ramp up costs. A larger size doesn't just mean more manufacturing space, it means more plastic, means more LCD or OLED screen, means a larger box size and so larger transport costs. Tiny changes for any individual console can multiply up to being hugely expensive choices when they're hoping to sell tens of millions, perhaps even 100 million of that particular model. Therefore, I expect their guiding principle will be for the form factor to be as small as possible for the amount of tech they're aiming to cram in. What about the great OLED versus LCD debate? As I said in the top of the video, I'm cautious about opining too much on technical specifications. It seems to me like it would be tricky to say to OLED owners, of which there are now a lot, that having upgraded to a new model on the strength primarily of the deluxe OLED screen, you're now going to be asked to buy a new model, but the screen is going to be simply LED. Just as a sales proposition, that feels like it could get a little rough. But ultimately, these differences are only going to bother a tiny fraction of the market, and even if people are bothered, it's unlikely to hold them back from buying the system if the LED tech looks impressive. Most likely they will simply have to find a way to explain the value of the new LED technology that Nintendo are using, even if it involves borderline making something up. Perhaps they can take a leaf out of Sega's book with the 9s and talk about how the graphics use blast processing to look amazing. Also, while historically OLED has been the more expensive option, it appears that OLED TV panels are cheaper to manufacture than the more modern mini LEDs. I doubt Nintendo decided to pull the trigger on marketing the Switch OLED revision explicitly around the OLED screen without some awareness of what their probable landing place was going to be for the Switch Successor screen, and that's why instinctively it feels to me to be a 70% likelihood that the new system will in fact retain an OLED screen. Of course, there is one case where Switch could have a smaller screen, and that's if they go for a 2-screen form factor once again. The DS did incredibly well for them, and while the 3DS stumbled out of the gate, it ultimately proved to be a solid seller and kept the wolf from the door for Nintendo through a difficult period of time in the Wii U's later life. There's also a sentimental attachment to the DS because the double-screen concept came from Hiroshi Yamauchi, Nintendo's chairman for over a half-century and the great-grandson of the founding member of the Nintendo company itself, Fusajiro Yamauchi. One of the last pieces of advice the retiring Hiroshi gave to Nintendo was to make a console with 2 screens, and from this inscrutable challenge, the DS was born. Now, I have mixed feelings about the DS. I know for many in the Nintendo YouTube space, this was the nostalgic golden age of Nintendo, but for me, I was very much a Game Boy and Game Boy Advance player, and by the time the DS rolled round, life was busy, and I didn't really have as much time to play Nintendo during this era. The DS form factor with its odd vertical shape always struck me as a bit strange in an era where the push in other forms of video media was to go for widescreen. I appreciate it may seem like sacrilege to the double-screen devotees, of whom there are many, but my hunch has always been that the 2-screen form factor was far less critical to the DS's success as the use of much better and more powerful touchscreen technology than was the standard in the era of dodgy Palm Pilot-like devices. Like motion controls for the Wii, the touchscreen was the element that really changed things for the Nintendo handheld. It was the defining technological leap, and Nintendo surfed that wave from the very start, years before Steve Jobs would bring the iPhone and the iPad to market using evolutions of the same technology. I think if they want to open up the facility for a second screen, a far more likely route would be by letting the system broadcast to the screen, creating a Wii U style arrangement. And Nintendo does like to nurse these ideas along across generations, so double screen, a concept that served Nintendo very well, is one of those ideas that a lot of people at Nintendo are likely still wedded to. Still, some kind of double screen or cross screen capacity does make sense, if only in the Wii U sense of broadcasting, but at this point it feels like a 30% chance that we will see any second screen capacity at all for the next system, and having the base system be a Switch DS feels like an even lower shot, more like a 10% shout. But as ever, these are subject to change as new evidence or new context comes to light, so leap into the discussion below. Thank you to my Patreon backers and to everyone who watches, likes, subscribes, shares, and comments, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.